On the cold M1 motorway, a dilapidated truck sped through the night. It wasn't a star-studded vehicle, but a mobile coffin. No seats, no seatbelts. Inside, 19-year-old Martin Lamble, with his angelic face, slept soundly atop a mountain of sharp audio equipment. He had no idea he was resting his head on the very blades of death. And then the crash happened. There was no miracle, only the cruel laws of physics. When the truck came to a halt, hundreds of pounds of speakers and steel in the back were propelled like cannonballs. Martin was crushed mercilessly by the very instruments he had loved his whole life. He was annihilated by his own artistic machine. Those who crawled out from the wreckage that night were no longer dreamy artists. They were survivors carrying permanent scars on their souls. This story isn't about the glamour of the stage. It's the story of people who were forced to step over the dead body of their youngest sibling to snatch life from the clutches of death. Martin Lamble was lying under a blanket on the side of a highway instead of sleeping in a feather bed in London. It was a scene starkly at odds with the pristine, manicured streets of St. John's Wood. Martin was an anomaly from the moment of his birth. The external environment of his childhood was constructed to prevent exactly this kind of ending. He was born into the upper echelons of the British middle class, a demographic stratum defined by safety, predictability, and a deep-seated aversion to risk. St. John's Wood, in the 1950s and early 60s, was a fortress of propriety. It was a world of high garden walls, polished brass door knockers, and Sunday roasts served on bone china. It was a place where voices were never raised, and futures were mapped out before children even learned to speak. His father was a man of letters, a figure of established respectability who viewed the world through the lens of academia and order. His mother was the curator of their domestic stability. The Lamble household was a quiet machine of expectation. The path laid out for Martin was paved with asphalt smoother than any motorway, a preparatory school education, acceptance into a venerable university like Oxford or Cambridge, a career in the civil service or law, and a retirement spent tending a garden in the home counties. While he sat at the mahogany dining table passing the salt with polite deference, his internal landscape was a riot of noise. He looked like the model son of St. John's Wood, clean-cut and destined for Oxford. But beneath the stiff collar of his school uniform, he was defecting. He didn't want the safety his parents prized. He wanted the vibration. He was a drummer waiting for a kit, a pulse waiting for a vein. He wanted the visceral, physical act of hitting a skin with a stick and hearing the world answer back with a crack. This was not merely a teenage rebellion, it was a class betrayal. In the rigid social hierarchy of post-war Britain, playing the drums was not a vocation for a boy like Martin Lamble. Drums were loud, they were primitive, they belonged to the working class, to the jazz clubs in Soho basements, to the sweaty, unwashed world of rock and roll. For a Lamble to become a drummer was akin to a racehorse deciding to pull a plow. It was a waste of breeding. Martin seized his first drum kit not as a toy, but as an instrument of liberation. He set it up in the only space available, shattering the carefully curated silence of the family home. When he played, the physical exertion was a stark contrast to the intellectual passivity expected of him. Sweat ran down his face. His hands blistered. He attacked the drums with a ferocity that frightened and confused his parents. They heard noise. Martin heard the only language that made sense to him. He began to sneak out. He traded the scent of lavender and floor wax for the smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke. He frequented the clubs where the new music was bubbling up from the underground. He watched the drummers with the intensity of a hawk, analyzing their grip, their kick drum patterns, the way they locked in with the bass player. He realized that drumming was not just hitting things, it was architecture. It was the foundation upon which the entire song rested. If the foundation was weak, the melody collapsed. He saw himself as a builder. His parents saw him as a vandal. The tension in the Lamble household grew with every beat. Arguments were conducted in hushed, furious tones behind closed doors to avoid alerting the neighbors. His father spoke of future and responsibility. Martin spoke of now and feeling. They were communicating across a generational and cultural chasm that was widening by the day. To his father, the drum kit was a phase, a childish toy to be discarded before the serious business of life began. To Martin, the drum kit was life. The prospect of sitting in an office for 40 years, suffocating in silence, terrified him more than the prospect of starving in a van. By 1966, the duality had become unsustainable. Martin was living two lives. By day, he maintained the facade of the dutiful student, although his grades were slipping as his focus drifted. By night, he was a creature of the London underground, a prodigy looking for a band. He knew he was good. He had a natural swing, a lightness of touch that most heavy-handed rock drummers lacked. He didn't just want to keep time, he wanted to color the sound. He drew influence not just from the rock charts, but from the American jazz greats. He played with his wrists loose and fluid, capable of intricate ghost notes and explosive fills. The external world of London was exploding with color. Carnaby Street, the King's Road, the psychedelic revolution. But Martin's personal world was narrowing to a single point of decision. He stood in his bedroom looking at the posters on his wall and the textbooks on his desk. The room was warm, safe, and paid for. It was a womb of privilege. Outside the window, the city was cold, indifferent, and dangerous. He packed a bag. It was a small, insignificant gesture that signaled the end of his previous life. He took his drumsticks. He took the few pounds he had saved. He left the books. He left the safety. He walked out the front door of the St. John's Wood House, leaving behind the ghost of the lawyer or doctor he was supposed to become. The walk to the tube station was the longest of his life. The pavement felt hard under his boots. The wind bit at his face. He was walking away from a guaranteed future into a void. He did not know that the void would eventually consume him. He only knew that the rhythm in his head had become too loud to ignore. He was trading a life of long, dull longevity for a life of high-frequency intensity. He was trading the velvet cage for the open road. He boarded the train, the doors hissing shut behind him, sealing his fate. He was no longer Martin Lamble, the promising student. He was Martin Lamble, the drummer. He was 19 years old, and the clock had started ticking down toward the M1 motorway. The train rattled south from St. John's Wood, carrying Martin Lamble away from the manicured hedges of his childhood and depositing him into the soot-stained heart of London's nascent underground. The physical distance was negligible, a matter of miles across the city, but the cultural displacement was absolute. He stepped onto the platform not merely as a passenger, but as a defector crossing a border into a war zone, where the weapons were electric guitars and the ideology was volume. The London he entered in 1967 was a sensory assault. The external environment vibrated with a frenetic, desperate energy. The clubs in Soho and the burgeoning psychedelic dens like the UFO Club were dark, humid spaces that smelled of patchouli oil, damp wool, and the acrid smoke of Turkish cigarettes. To a boy raised in a home where the air was filtered through heavy velvet curtains and politeness, this new world was terrified and thrilling in equal measure. He carried his drumsticks in his back pocket, a totem of his new identity, and navigated the crowded streets with the wide-eyed caution of a tourist in a foreign land. He was looking for a pulse, and he found it in a rehearsal room that smelled of stale beer and ozone. The entity known as Fairport Convention was, at this stage, less a band and more a collective of serious young intellectuals attempting to decipher the code of American West Coast rock. They were not the rowdy, hotel-trashing archetypes of later rock mythology. They were scholars of sound. Richard Thompson, the guitarist, stood in the corner, hunched over his instrument like a monk illuminating a manuscript. Ashley Hutchings, the bassist and self-appointed leader, organized sheet music and cables with the fussiness of a librarian. When Martin walked in, the visual contrast was jarring. He was undeniably the kid, while the other members carried a brooding existential weight, wearing their seriousness like a heavy coat. Martin radiated a kinetic, puppy-like energy. He was physically slight, his face unlined and open, his hair a riot of curls that refused to be tamed. He looked less like a rock star and more like a schoolboy who had lost his way on a field trip. The audition was not a formal affair. It was a trial by fire. They asked him to play. Martin sat behind the kit, adjusting the height of the snare drum, tightening the wing nut on the cymbal stand. The hardware felt cold and familiar under his hands. This was his cockpit. The moment he sat down, the external awkwardness evaporated. He picked up the sticks, not with the heavy-fisted grip of a rock drummer, but with the loose, traditional grip of a jazz player. 1969 was the era of the Butchers on the drums. The world was raving about the frenzied violence of Keith Moon or the thunderous, hammer-like stomps of John Bonham. Amidst a forest of rock-breaking drums using brute force to subdue that sound, Martin emerged as a sculptor. He didn't beat the drums, he conversed with them. His presence was a testament to a different evolutionary branch of rock, more refined, more intellectual, a branch that had been severed just as it began to blossom. He counted them in. The sound that filled the room was a revelation. Most drummers in London at that time were trying to emulate the heavy, thudding backbeat of the blues rock explosion. They hammered the drums into submission. Martin did not hammer. He danced. He played with a lightness that bordered on the ethereal. His kick drum pattern was not a dull thud, but a syncopated heartbeat that locked in perfectly with Hutchings' bass lines. He utilized the hi-hat not just as a timekeeping device, but as a texture, opening and closing the cymbals to create a breathing, shushing sound that filled the sonic gaps without clogging them. Richard Thompson looked up from his fretboard. The serious, brooding guitarist cracked a smile. They realized instantly that the missing component of their engine had been found. They needed a drummer who could navigate the complex time signatures and improvisational flights they were attempting, and they had found one in the form of a teenager who looked like he should be doing homework. Joining Fairport Convention was for Martin an induction into a secret society. The external reality of his life shifted from the solitary confinement of his bedroom to the communal chaos of the band. He was the youngest, the baby of the group, a label that carried both affection and condescension. He was adopted by them, shielded by them, and ultimately shaped by them. The dynamic was established early. Thompson and Hutchings were the architects, drawing up the blueprints of the songs. Martin was the engineer who made sure the structure didn't collapse. But his internal experience was one of constant low-level anxiety. He was playing catch-up. He was skipping the developmental years of adulthood, leaping straight from boyhood into the professional grind. He watched the others smoke, drink, and discuss politics with a sophistication he felt he lacked. He compensated with enthusiasm. He became the spark plug, the source of morale when the van broke down or the promoter refused to pay. His talent, however, was undeniable. As the band moved from rehearsals to live performances, Martin's drumming became the talk of the London circuit. But the external reality of gigging was a harsh education. They played in pubs and clubs where the floors were sticky with spilled ale and the air was thick with smoke. Here, the starkest contrast of Martin's existence played out nightly. On stage, elevated on the drum riser, he was a god of rhythm. He controlled the room. He could bring the volume down to a whisper or explode into a frenzy that drove the crowd wild. He was powerful, competent, and essential. Step off the riser, and he was a minor. The licensing laws in the United Kingdom were strict. Martin was legally too young to be in the very venues where he was the main attraction. The band developed a routine to handle this absurdity. While the rest of Fairport Convention stood at the bar after a set, holding pints of bitter and accepting the adulation of the fans, Martin was often banished. He spent hours in the kitchens of pubs, sitting on crates of vegetables, listening to the muffled sounds of the party through the swinging doors. He waited in the freezing van in the alleyway, reading comic books by the light of a street lamp. He sat on fire escapes, shivering in his stage clothes, while the adults conducted the business of rock and roll inside. Internally, this enforced isolation created a strange dissonance. He was the star of the show, yet he was treated like contraband. He felt the humiliation of being excluded, the sharp reminder that he was not fully one of them. He was a professional musician who had to ask permission to use the bathroom. He sat in the cold, smelling the grease of the kitchen exhaust, and told himself it was worth it. He told himself that the hour on stage justified the 3 hours in the alley. The rhythm in his head was the only thing that kept him warm. The band's ambition grew. They were no longer content with mimicking American folk rock. They wanted to deconstruct it. The recording sessions for their albums became laboratories of sound. The studio, Sound Techniques in Chelsea, became Martin's second home. It was a windowless bunker filled with expensive microphones and a tangle of cables. This was where Martin truly thrived. The external environment of the studio was sterile and controlled, a stark contrast to the chaos of the pubs. Here, he could hear every nuance of his playing. He became obsessed with the texture of sound. He experimented with different stick weights, different cymbal alloys, different tunings of the snare skin. He wasn't just hitting things, he was sculpting air. The recording of the track A Sailor's Life for the album Unhalf-Bricking stands as the testament to his genius and his tragedy. The song was a traditional folk ballad, but the band decided to stretch it, to break it open and see what was inside. It was an improvisation, a high-wire act performed without a net. They set up in the studio in a circle, eyeing each other. The tape began to roll. Martin started with a pulse, a gentle rolling pattern on the toms that sounded like the hull of a ship hitting the waves. He didn't lock the band into a rigid grid. He allowed the time to breathe. As Richard Thompson's guitar began to weave intricate modal lines, Martin responded. He didn't just follow, he anticipated. When the guitar surged, Martin surged with it, crashing on the cymbals like breaking water. When the guitar receded, Martin pulled back, leaving vast open spaces of silence that were as heavy as the noise. For 11 minutes, the boy from St. John's Wood held the entire sonic structure together. He was in a trance state. His internal monologue ceased. There was no father to disappoint, no age laws to obey, no cold van to sleep in. There was only the connection between his hand, the stick, and the skin. He was pure electricity. When the take ended, there was silence in the control room. The engineer looked at the band. They knew they had captured lightning. Martin sat behind his kit, sweat dripping from his nose onto the snare drum, his chest heaving. He looked small again. The giant who had just commanded the storm shrank back into the teenager who needed a ride home. The success of the albums brought fame, But fame in 1968 England was a localized, gritty affair. It did not mean limousines and private jets. It meant recognized faces on the tube and slightly better billing on the posters. It meant more work. The Boy Wonder label began to chafe. The press loved the angle, the prodigy drummer who looked like a cherub. They asked him questions about his parents, about his school days, treating him like a novelty act. Martin answered politely, his St. John's Wood breeding kicking in, but internally he seethed. He wanted to be respected as a musician, not petted like a precocious pet. He began to feel the physical toll of his double life. The late nights, the poor diet of service station pies and lukewarm tea, the constant hauling of heavy equipment. It was eroding him. His hands, once soft, were now covered in calluses and blisters that never fully healed. His back ached from the terrible posture required to play drums for hours on a cheap stool. He looked at his bandmates. Richard Thompson was growing darker, more introspective, channeling his anxieties into songwriting. Ashley Hutchings was becoming more rigid, obsessed with the logistics of the band's trajectory. Sandy Denny, the singer who had joined them, brought her own volatile emotional weather. Martin was the buffer. He absorbed their stress. He was the one who cracked the joke when the silence in the van got too heavy. He was the one who smoothed over the arguments. He was 19 years old, and he was carrying the emotional weight of 5 adults. One night, after a particularly grueling session, Martin sat alone in the studio while the others went out for air. The room was dim, lit only by the VU meters on the console. He stared at his drum kit, standing in the isolation booth. It looked like a medieval torture device, a collection of metal rims and stretched skins designed to be beaten. He felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of exhaustion. It wasn't just tired muscles. It was a soul-deep weariness. He thought about his bedroom in St. John's Wood. He thought about the clean sheets, the quiet street, the books he had left behind. He wondered, for a fleeting, treacherous second, if he had made a mistake. He wondered if the freedom he had chased was just another form of captivity. But then he looked at the tape reels spinning on the machine. He saw the magnetic tape accumulating, storing the vibrations he had created. That was the trade. He was trading his youth, his health, and his safety for magnetic immortality. He picked up his sticks, tapped them together, 1, 2, 3, 4, and the rhythm returned, pushing the doubt back into the darkness. He stood up, wiped his face, and prepared for the next take. The machine needed to be fed. The tape reels stopped spinning at Sound Techniques, and the studio door opened to release Martin Lamble back into the grayscale reality of early 1969. The critical acclaim for Unhalf-Bricking was beginning to mount, creating a feedback loop of demand that the band's infrastructure was woefully ill-equipped to handle. The music press, desperate for a homegrown answer to the American West Coast sound, had anointed Fairport Convention as the chosen ones. They printed glossy photos of the band in Hyde Park, looking ethereal and bohemian, draped in scarves and velvet, framed by the dappled sunlight of a London spring. These images were distributed to thousands of teenagers who pinned them to bedroom walls, projecting their own fantasies of freedom onto the faces of the musicians. The internal experience of living inside that photograph, however, was a study in grim endurance. The romantic notion of the troubadour lifestyle disintegrated the moment Martin stepped out of his front door and climbed into the vehicle that served as the band's primary habitat. It was a Commer van, a beige, boxy utilitarian beast that had been designed to haul plumbing supplies or bakery crates, not a 6-piece rock band and a ton of amplification equipment. It was not a tour bus. There were no bunks, no sanitation facilities, no climate control. It was a hollow metal shell resonating with the noise of the road and the smell of 6 adults living in close confinement. The contrast between the sophisticated, intricate music they produced and the primitive conditions in which they traveled was the central absurdity of Martin's life. He sat on a wheel arch, his knees pulled up to his chest, trying to find a position that didn't cut off the circulation to his legs. The suspension of the Comer was non-existent. Every pothole on the A-roads sent a shock wave through the chassis that rattled his teeth. Around him, the other members of the band had staked out their territories in the gloom. Sandy Denny curled up in the front passenger seat when she could, or sat on a crate in the back, smoking cigarettes and staring out at the rain-streaked darkness. Richard Thompson and Simon Nicole leaned against the stacks of Marshall cabinets, their bodies swaying in unison with the movement of the vehicle. The van was a hierarchy of discomfort. The equipment took priority. The amplifiers, the PA system, the guitars in their hard cases, and Martin's drum hardware were packed with Tetris-like precision. The humans were an afterthought, forced to mold themselves into the negative spaces left by the gear. This created a physical and psychological claustrophobia that was relentless. Martin felt the cold metal of a cymbal stand pressing against his ribs. He felt the sharp corner of a speaker cabinet digging into his shoulder. He was literally being squeezed by his own art. The driver of this purgatorial vessel was Harvey Bramham. Harvey was 19 years old, the same age as Martin. He was not a professional chauffeur. He was a friend, a roadie, and a general dog's body who had been swept up in the band's orbit. The responsibilities placed on Harvey's shoulders were criminal in their magnitude. He was expected to drive hundreds of miles through the night on unlit, single-carriageway roads. Upon arrival, he was expected to unload the van, hauling the heavy Hammond organ and the dense speaker cabinets up flights of stairs or through narrow stage doors. He then had to set up the equipment, troubleshoot the electrical gremlins, mix the sound during the show, break down the gear, reload the van, and then get back behind the wheel to drive another 200 miles to the next gig. Martin watched Harvey from the back of the van. He saw the way Harvey's head would dip as the white lines of the motorway hypnotized him. He saw the way Harvey would slap his own face or wind down the window to let the freezing air blast him awake. Internally, Martin felt a creeping dread. He knew the math didn't work. He knew that the human body required sleep, and Harvey wasn't getting any. But the external environment of the music business did not allow for pauses. If they missed a gig, they didn't get paid. If they didn't get paid, they couldn't buy gas. The economic fragility of the band was the whip that kept them moving. This was the cruelest paradox, the indelible stain on the entertainment industry of the time. These young artists were creating works of art that would be worth millions of pounds in the future, yet their lives that night were valued less than a night's sleep in a cheap hotel. The management system had squeezed them dry, treating them as disposable batteries to power a massive money-making machine. That cramped Comer van was not just a means of transportation, it was the embodiment of exploitation, where talent and human lives were piled on top of each other, squeezed and devalued like inanimate cargo. This relentless motion began to erode Martin's sense of time. The days blurred into a seamless loop of damp asphalt and fluorescent lights. He would wake up in the van, his neck stiff, his mouth tasting of stale coffee, unsure of where they were or what day it was. The cities of England, Manchester, Leeds, Bristol, Newcastle, lost their distinct characteristics. They became merely a series of loading docks and dressing rooms. The external world was reduced to a tunnel of headlights cutting through the fog. His body, still recovering from the relentless respiratory infections of the previous winter, began to weaken further. He lost the last vestiges of the St. John's Wood softness. His hands were permanently stained with the gray grime of the road, a mix of aluminum dust from the flight cases, oil from the van, and the pervasive soot of the industrial towns they visited. He looked at his fingernails under the harsh light of a motorway service station bathroom and saw the dirt impacted beneath them. He scrubbed until his skin was raw, but the stain seemed to be in the pores. He felt like he was turning into a part of the machine, slowly calcifying into something hard and industrial. The juxtaposition between the stage and the van created a violent psychological whiplash. For 90 minutes a night, Martin was a star. The band would take the stage at a university union or a civic hall, and the transformation would occur. The lights would go down, the crowd would roar, and the adrenaline would flood his system. He would sit behind the kit, the one place where he felt total control, and drive the band through the set. He played with a manic intensity, burning off the frustration of the journey. The music was transcendent. Sandy's voice soared over the instruments, clear and bell-like, weaving tales of ancient sailors and mythical lovers. Martin's drums danced beneath her, complex and light, defying the gravity of their situation. But the moment the final chord faded, the carriage turned back into a pumpkin. The adrenaline crashed, leaving him shaking and hollow. The loadout began immediately. There were no road crews to handle the heavy lifting. Martin had to break down his kit, carrying the heavy hardware and the bass drum through crowds of lingering fans who wanted to touch him or talk to him. He smiled politely, answering their questions about his influences or his hair, while his muscles screamed in protest. He felt like a fraud. They saw a glamorous rock musician. He felt like a furniture mover. The danger was a constant, unwanted passenger. The Calmer was a death trap, overloaded, top-heavy, and failing. The brakes screamed with a metal-on-metal grind, and in high winds, the van didn't drive. It drifted. Harvey wasn't just driving. He was wrestling a beast that wanted to leave the road. There were omens, small incidents that served as warning shots across the bow. A tire blowout on the A1 that sent them skidding onto the hard shoulder, the heavy equipment shifting ominously behind them. A near miss with a lorry in heavy rain, where Martin looked out the window and saw the spinning wheels of the truck inches from his face. On these occasions, the silence in the van would deepen. No one spoke of the danger. To acknowledge it was to give it power. To speak of the possibility of a crash was to admit that their entire existence was hanging by a thread. They developed a fatalistic humor, making jokes about the mobile coffin, laughing too loud and too long, a collective denial mechanism designed to keep the panic at bay. Martin's internal monologue during these drives became a dark prayer. He would wedge himself into his designated nook among the amplifiers, pull his coat over his head, and try to visualize the safety of his childhood bedroom. He thought of the solid brick walls of his parents' house, the heavy oak doors, the feeling of permanence. He realized that he had traded safety for significance, but he began to wonder if the price was too high. He was playing the best music of his life, but he felt like he was living on borrowed time. By May 1969, the fatigue was absolute. The band had been touring relentlessly to support the rising success of their singles. They were the darlings of the underground press, the British Jefferson Airplane, the future of folk rock. But the future felt very far away to Martin as he sat in the van, watching the English countryside roll by in a gray blur. The gig at Mother's in Birmingham on May 11th was circled on the calendar as a major event. Mother's was not just a pub, it was a cathedral of the counter-culture. It was the place where Pink Floyd recorded, where the DJ John Peel held court. Playing Mother's was a validation. It meant you had arrived. The drive up to Birmingham was tense. The van was acting up, the engine coughing and sputtering. Harvey was exhausted, his eyes rimmed with red, his hands gripping the wheel with white-knuckled intensity. He had driven them from a gig in Sheffield the night before, then to London, then back north to Birmingham. He was operating on a deficit of sleep that was biologically unsustainable. Martin watched him from the back, feeling a surge of empathy mixed with terror. He wanted to tell Harvey to pull over, to sleep, to let the gig go, but the momentum of the machine was too strong. The contract was signed. The audience was waiting. They arrived at the venue in the late afternoon. The load-in was difficult, up a flight of narrow stairs. Martin carried his bass drum, the heavy wooden shell banging against his shins. He set up his kit on the stage, the familiar ritual grounding him. He tuned the snare, tapping the head near the lugs, listening for the perfect pitch. For a moment, the world narrowed to the simple physics of tension and tone. The show that night was electric. The room was packed, the air thick with smoke and anticipation. When Fairport Convention hit the stage, the energy in the room shifted. They played with a ferocity that belied their exhaustion. Richard Thompson's guitar work was stinging and precise. Sandy Denny sang with a power that seemed to crack the plaster on the walls. And Martin played like a man possessed. He drove the band, pushing the tempo, filling the spaces with intricate rolling fills that drew cheers from the crowd. For 90 minutes, the external environment matched his internal desire. He was exactly where he wanted to be. He was creating. He was alive. The fear of the van, the fatigue, the dirt, it all evaporated in the heat of the performance. He looked out at the sea of faces and felt a surge of triumph. They had done it. They had conquered Birmingham. But the encore ended. The house lights came up, the reality returned. The loadout was slow, the adrenaline faded, leaving them shivering in the cool night air. They packed the gear back into the calmer van, the amplifiers, the guitars, the PA system, and the drums. Martin broke down his kit, placing the cymbals into their bag, the stands into the hardware case. He loaded them into the back of the van, stacking them high against the metal bulkhead. He was building the wall that would soon crush him. It was past midnight when they were finally ready to leave. The destination was London, 100 miles to the south. The sensible decision would have been to find a hotel, to sleep in Birmingham and drive back in the morning. But money was tight, and the pull of their own beds in London was strong. They voted with their exhaustion. They would drive. Harvey climbed into the driver's seat. Richard Thompson took the passenger seat next to him. In the back, the rest of the band and their entourage scrambled for space. Martin Lamble climbed onto the top of the equipment pile. It was the only place left. He found a flat spot on top of a speaker cabinet, spreading out a sleeping bag. He was joined by Jeannie Franklin, Richard's girlfriend, who had come along for the show. They lay there in the dark, hovering 3 feet above the floor of the van, suspended on a bed of metal and wood. The van pulled out of the parking lot and onto the empty streets of Birmingham, heading for the motorway slip road. Martin closed his eyes. The vibration of the engine traveled up through the speaker cabinet and into his spine. It was a low, steady hum. He tried to relax his muscles to surrender to the motion. He thought about the show, replays of the fills he had executed playing in his mind. He thought about the next day, a rare day off in London. He would sleep late, he would take a bath, he would eat a meal that didn't come from a foil wrapper. The van hit the M1 motorway and accelerated. The streetlights flashed by overhead, rhythmic bursts of orange light that illuminated the interior of the cargo hold for a fraction of a second before plunging it back into darkness. In those flashes, Martin could see the jagged outlines of the equipment surrounding him. The mic stands looked like spears. The cymbal cases looked like shields. He was a soldier lying in an armory. He drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep. His dreams were fragmented, filled with the noise of the road and the phantom sensation of falling. He did not know that in the front seat, Harvey Bramham was fighting a losing battle against biology. The white lines on the road were blurring. The red tail lights of the trucks ahead were elongating into streaks. The silence in the van was heavy, the breathing of the passengers syncing with the drone of the engine. Martin Lamble was 19 years old. He lay on an altar of amplification, speeding through the English night at 70 miles per hour. The distance between his internal world of dreams and the external world of steel and concrete was rapidly closing to zero. The rhythm of his life, which had begun with such promise in St. John's Wood and flourished in the studios of Chelsea, was approaching its final catastrophic downbeat. The hypnotic drone of the Commer van's engine became the metronome for the occupant's unconsciousness as the vehicle pushed further south into the early hours of May 12th. The motorway was a ribbon of gray monotony, the M1 stretching out like a spine connecting the industrial heartlands of the Midlands to the capital. Inside the cargo hold, the air was stale, recycled through the lungs of 6 exhausted people and flavored with the metallic tang of the amplifiers. Martin Lamble, suspended on his makeshift bed of speaker cabinets, drifted in a liminal state. His body registered the vibrations of the road, the rhythmic thump-thump of the tires crossing expansion joints, but his mind had decoupled from the immediate danger. In the semi-darkness, his internal landscape was likely a collage of the previous hours. The heat of the stage lights at Mother's, the smell of the dressing room, the satisfaction of a complex fill executed perfectly during a sailor's life. He was 19, and his brain was wiring itself to process the world through the filter of music. The hum of the differential gear sounded like a synthesizer drone. The wind rushing past the unsealed door seals sounded like a cymbal wash. He was safe in his mind, wrapped in the insulation of his own talent and the perceived invincibility of youth. He did not know that he was lying on top of a pile of unsecured heavy ordnance. In the front seat, the reality was strictly biological. Harvey Bramham was fighting a losing war against his own circadian rhythms. The human brain is not designed to operate heavy machinery after 20 hours of wakefulness, physical labor, and the cognitive load of driving through the night. The monotony of the motorway, with its uniform lighting and lack of visual stimuli, induced a state known as highway hypnosis. Harvey's eyes were open, fixed on the cone of light projected by the headlamps, but his processing speed had slowed to a crawl. The external environment was stripped of detail, just black asphalt and white lines, while his internal world was narrowing to a single desperate imperative: keep the vehicle between the lines until London. They passed the sign for the Scratchwood service station. It was a marker of progress, a signal that they were nearing the city limits. The tension in the van should have eased. They were almost home. But it was precisely this proximity to safety that proved fatal. The adrenaline that keeps a tired driver alert often evaporates when the destination is in sight. Harvey's eyelids grew heavy. The muscles in his neck relaxed. The connection between his hands and the steering wheel became fluid, then slack. For a fraction of a second, the Commer van ceased to be a controlled vehicle and became a projectile subject, only to the laws of inertia. The drift began slowly. The van angled toward the soft verge on the left side of the carriageway. The tires left the asphalt and hit the grass. The change in auditory feedback from the smooth hum of the road to the sudden violent rumble of rough terrain snapped Harvey back to consciousness. Panic is a poor driver. His reaction was instinctive rather than calculated. He wrenched the steering wheel to the right, attempting to force the top-heavy vehicle back onto the road. Physics took over. The center of gravity in the Commer was perilously high, raised even further by the stack of equipment and the people sleeping on top of it. The violent correction caused the weight to shift aggressively. The tires lost adhesion. The van did not turn, it tripped. Inside the cargo hold, the sensation for Martin changed instantly, from a gentle vibration to a violent weightlessness. He woke up not to a sound, but to a shift in the axis of his world. One moment gravity was pulling him down into his sleeping bag. The next, it was pulling him sideways. There was no time for a conscious thought, no time to formulate fear. His internal monologue was cut mid-sentence. The van left the embankment. It rolled. The interior of the Commer became a centrifuge of destruction. The equipment which Martin had meticulously packed and cared for, the tools of his art, was liberated from gravity. The heavy Marshall amplifiers, built of solid wood and heavy magnets, became unmoored battering rams. The drum hardware, steel stands and iron pedals, turned into shrapnel. With no bulkhead to shield them, and sleeping precariously atop the pile, Martin and Jeannie were trapped in the center of the vortex. As the van tumbled down the 40-foot embankment, the roof collapsed and the sides buckled. The noise was apocalyptic, the screaming of tearing metal, the shattering of glass, and the sickening thud of heavy objects impacting flesh. For Martin, the external environment collapsed inward. The drum kit he had played hours earlier, the instrument that gave him his identity and his voice, was now a chaotic mass of metal hurtling toward him. The bass drum, the toms, the heavy cymbal stands. They did not distinguish between the boy who played them and the walls of the van. The violence was absolute and instantaneous. Martin was thrown from his perch and pinned against the crushing metal of the van's side panel. The equipment followed him down, a landslide of wood and steel. He was buried. The air was driven from his lungs not by the gas of a heater this time, but by the blunt force of the industry he served. The crush injuries were catastrophic. The delicate machinery of his body, the hands that could play ghost notes, the ears that could tune a snare, was destroyed by the crude machinery of the tour. The van came to rest on its side in a field of wet grass, a mangled heap of steel and silence. The chaos of the roll lasted perhaps 5 seconds, but the stillness that followed felt eternal. The engine had stalled. The headlights were smashed, plunging the scene into the gray obscurity of the pre-dawn gloom. The only sound was the ticking of the cooling metal and the hiss of steam escaping a ruptured radiator. Inside the wreckage, the survivors began to regain consciousness, their minds struggling to bridge the gap between the sleep they had been in and the nightmare they had woken up to. Richard Thompson, who had been in the passenger seat, found himself thrown clear or partially ejected. He lay in the grass, his shoulders shattered, his body bruised, his mind reeling in a state of shock. He tried to stand, but his equilibrium was gone. He looked at the shape of the van in the darkness. It didn't look like a vehicle anymore. It looked like a piece of industrial waste dropped from the sky. He called out. His voice was thin and ragged in the damp air. "Martin? Jeannie?" There was no answer from the pile of debris. Ashley Hutchings, the bassist, crawled from the wreckage. His face was broken, blood obscuring his vision. Simon Nichols stumbled out, dazed. They were a group of young men barely out of their teens, standing in a muddy field in their stage clothes, shivering in the cold morning air. They were survivors of a disaster they couldn't yet comprehend. The external world was a blur of pain and confusion. They moved toward the van, pulling at the twisted metal, trying to reach the friends trapped inside. They moved pieces of equipment, a speaker cabinet here, a guitar case there. The objects felt impossibly heavy. The tools of their trade had become the rubble of a tomb. When they found Martin, the hope that had sustained them through the initial shock evaporated. He was lifeless. The trauma he'd sustained was incompatible with life. He lay amidst the scattered cymbals, the bronze discs glinting dully in the low light. The juxtaposition was grotesque, the creator destroyed by the creation. The boy who had given the band its swing, its lightness, its American jazz flair, was gone. Jeannie Franklin was also dead. The tragedy was compounded. 2 young lives extinguished because of a microsleep, because of a lack of a partition, because of the economics of a band that couldn't afford a safer way to travel. The arrival of the emergency services brought a harsh, bureaucratic light to the scene. Blue lights flashed against the wet grass, creating a strobe effect that disoriented the survivors. Police officers in high-visibility jackets moved with efficient detachment. They were not dealing with the death of a musical prodigy. They were dealing with a road traffic accident. They measured skid marks. They took statements. They photographed the debris field. To Richard Thompson, watching from the periphery while paramedics tended to his shoulder, the scene was surreal. He saw his guitar case lying open in the mud. He saw Martin's drum stool, the seat where the boy had sat to command the rhythm, lying upside down. The external environment was indifferent to the loss. The traffic on the M1 continued to flow, cars rushing past the scene, drivers slowing down to rubberneck at the smash before accelerating away, thankful it wasn't them. The ambulance ride to the hospital was a blur of antiseptic smells and hushed voices. The survivors were separated, treated for their physical injuries, but the psychological severance had already occurred. They were no longer the same band that had played at Mother's. That band had died in the ditch. The people who arrived at the hospital were remnants, hollowed out by grief and guilt. Richard Thompson sat in a hospital bed, staring at the ceiling. His inner thoughts were a chaotic storm. He replayed the crash, the sound of the metal screaming, the silence that followed. He thought of Martin's laugh, the way he would tap his sticks together before a count-in. He thought of the future they had planned, the tours, the albums, the inevitable rise to stardom. It all seemed like a cruel joke now. The external world, the nurses checking vitals, the police asking for details felt distant, separated from him by a wall of trauma. A cruel irony gnawed at Richard's mind. He was the one sitting in the death seat next to the driver. Yet he survived, while Martin, in the back, the safest, most comfortable spot on top of the luggage, met his demise. The rules of survival had been overturned by a fateful steering maneuver. This survivor's guilt would haunt Richard for half a century afterward, transforming his music from the light, airy tones of youth into dark, edgy, and tormented melodies, as if every note he played carried the scar of that night. The news of the crash began to filter out to the wider world, but it traveled slowly. There was no internet, no instant 24-hour news cycle. It moved through phone calls to parents, through telegrams, to management. The parents in St. John's Wood received the knock on the door that every parent dreads. The police officer standing on the step, hat in hand, delivering the news that the rebellion was over. Martin was not coming home. He was not going to university. He was not going to be a star. He was a body in a morgue in Hertfordshire. Back at the crash site, the recovery vehicle arrived to winch the Commer van out of the ditch. As the wreck was lifted, more debris fell from the interior. Drumsticks, a tambourine, personal effects, the mundane items of a life on the road scattered in the dirt. The sun was fully up now, illuminating the scar in the earth where the van had plowed through the grass. The silence of the drums was absolute. The cymbals, gathered up by the police as personal property, would never ring again. They were evidence now. The energy that Martin Lamble had poured into them, the kinetic joy, the syncopated rhythms, the jazz-inflected fills, had dissipated into the atmosphere. The boy wonder, who had played with the wisdom of an old soul and the energy of a child, had been erased by the brute physics of unsecure cargo. For the survivors, the physical pain was manageable, bones knit, cuts heal, but the internal landscape had been scorched. They had looked into the abyss and seen that the universe did not care about their music. It did not care about their talent. It cared only about mass and velocity. They were left with the terrifying realization that their art was fragile, housed in bodies that broke easily, transported in vehicles that offered no protection. As Richard Thompson lay in the hospital, the drugs dulling the pain in his shoulder, he began to hear a new kind of music in his head. It was not the sunny, optimistic folk rock they had played the night before. It was darker. It was heavier. It was the sound of mourning. The crash had killed the drummer, but it had birthed a ghost that would haunt the music of Fairport Convention forever. The innocence was gone, replaced by the hard, cold knowledge of mortality. The sterile cleanliness of the hospital room contrasted sharply with the muddy darkness of the M1 motorway embankment. Richard Thompson lay there, his mind still reeling from the violent rollover of the van. When the final news arrived that Martin Lamble and Jeannie Franklin were dead, it came not as a shock, but as a heavy, agonizing confirmation. He was only 20 years old, lying on pristine white sheets while his best friend and lover lay in the morgue. The band, once a unified entity, was suddenly torn apart. Ashley Hutchings returned to his parents' home, burdened by the anguish of an architect watching his building crumble. He had been the one to schedule the funeral, to hire that cheap car. The funeral took place in the somber, middle-class atmosphere Martin had tried to escape. The survivors stood there in their dark suits, feeling like imposters. They were the ones who had taken Martin away, and the ones who had put him in that van. The question of the future hung like a guillotine blade. Stopping meant letting death define them. Continuing meant living in a haunted house. Ultimately, they decided to move on, not out of solidarity, but out of resignation. They were musicians. They didn't know what else to do. But finding a replacement for Martin became a torment. Every drummer who auditioned played too rigidly, stifling the music Martin had once allowed to breathe. They realized a painful truth. Replacing Martin was physically impossible. The turning point came with Dave Mattax, a drummer with a military disciplined style, a complete contrast to Martin's free-flowing jazz. But within that rigidity, Ashley Hutchings saw a new path. If they couldn't fly, they would march. They abandoned the American folk rock style in favor of the powerful stomping rhythms of Old English folk music. To achieve this, they retreated to Farley Chamberlain, an isolated manor house. There, instead of discussing the accident, they channeled all their trauma into the album Liege and Leaf, not a celebration of their legacy, but a dark musical remembrance. Their choice to return to ancient, bloody folk songs, tales of murder, ghosts, and eternal separation was no coincidence. It was the only psychological therapy they could cling to. They could no longer sing cheerful love songs with broken hearts. They were forced to borrow from ancient English tragedies to weep for their own present tragedy. This album was a resounding success and became legendary not only because of its masterful technique, but because it contained the genuine pain and fear of those who had just stepped over the corpses of their loved ones to continue living. The aftermath brought devastating clarity. The legal system valued the life of the 19-year-old genius with a paltry sentence for the driver, a temporary driving ban, and a 100-pound fine. The band's towering success built from that tragedy became a poison pill. The glory could not outweigh the guilt, forcing both Ashley Hutchings and Sandy Denny to leave shortly after Liege and Leaf was released. Today, the M1 motorway still bustles with traffic, indifferently passing by where Martin fell. He has become a forgotten ghost in documentaries, a marginal note in history. But the only immortality lies on the vinyl records. When the needle drops to A Sailor's Life, the van vanishes and Martin comes back to life. For those 11 minutes, he remains forever the brilliant young man leading his band toward the horizon. He died so that the music could change. The van is gone, the man is lost, only the rhythm echoes forever in the silence of dawn.